Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. I thank you for your good work, and I wish you the best as you go back into the private sector. I appreciate your work as Commissioner of the FDA, and just to kind of dovetail on to Senator Baldwin's comments, and I wasn't going to do this, but I always thought milk came from an animal. But what the hell, you know, things change. Look, earlier this week, the Department of Justice released a statement to the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit affirming a ruling in a Texas case that found the entire ACA unconstitutional. You know that, that's not breaking news. I'm worried about the impact of the ruling. I'm worried on a whole bunch of reasons, but I want to touch on something that Senator Leahy talked about, because the ACA created a pathway for FDA approval of biosimilars. In your announcement of this plan, you said enabling a path to competition for biologics and biosimilars is key for reducing costs. It's my understanding that if a judge rules the ACA unconstitutional, there's no longer statutory authority for the FDA to encourage development of biosimilars. If the biosimilars approval pathway was a part of the ACA, which it was, and it's overturned, wouldn't this thwart the FDA's plan to increase access to biosimilars?
Well, certainly if the statutory framework was overturned, it would. I would hope that, you know, if that came to pass, Congress would work to reauthorize it. So it's a very important pathway, and we fully support it, obviously, and we think it's been profoundly impactful for consumers.
I agree, although I don't need to tell you, you've been here long enough to know that predicting what Congress will do or won't do, whether it requires common sense or not, is pretty difficult. There was another thing here that was brought up earlier. How close are we to a non-opioid painkiller?
There's products in development that look very promising, but they're in early stages of development. It's hard to predict how quickly they can move through development, because a product that was a non-addictive alternative for the treatment of pain could presumably qualify for breakthrough designation, and perhaps did, but I couldn't disclose that. So they could move through efficiently.
Well, it looks to me that if we ever get to a point where it actually happens, is effective, we could shut some of this garbage off the market.
Right. I mean, I share your hopes. I would say that historically there's been no free lunch when it comes to drugs for the treatment of chronic pain. Every drug that we have marketed has some concerns associated with it, whether it's the opioids that have the addictive potential or something like Tylenol. So we've never had a perfect drug here.
Okay. I want to talk about something I don't think we've talked about today yet, but maybe we have. I wasn't here for the whole thing, and that's cell-based meat, lab-grown meat. The product of genuine animal muscle cells that are cultured in a lab to produce a meat product that's very similar to meat in taste and appearance and texture, but has no bone and no fat.
Senator, it's not meat.
That is absolutely correct. And that's the point I'm going to get to in a second. There was a point in time in my life where my wife and I operated a custom butcher shop. And just as I figured milk ought to be from an animal, meat always came from an animal, okay? And if it's done in a lab, I guess you could make that connection back. But I wondered. So early this month, Secretary Perdue announced that the FSIS and the FDA reached an agreement to regulate cell-based meat. Do you think that cell-based meat should be labeled meat or poultry?
Well, you don't make it sound very appetizing, but I'll let your comment stand. Won't comment on it. But I believe, you know, we've worked out a framework here where FDA is going to have regulatory purview over the production aspects of this that we know very well, the culturing process, the biotechnology process, and we consider that the pre-harvest process. After the product itself comes out of the culturing process and it's no longer in a living system, which we're calling the post-harvest process, USDA is going to have full purview over that process. And that would include the labeling of it. That would include the labeling considerations. It would include the packaging, how it gets flavored, spiced, all that. So ultimately, I think it's going to be within USDA's purview to make a decision around how these products are labeled.
So you don't believe it'll be FDA will be able to play a role in this?
Or we would certainly advise on it and provide expert input and be part of a collaborative process. But ultimately, the authority for the post-harvest process is going to be within the purview of USDA.
So let me ask you this, as long as my time's about up, but I don't see anybody else in line. whose job is it going to be to test this product, to find out if it, I mean, you talked about, and I don't want to make the parallels here because they are a little different, but to find out if it has the same nutritional value, the same health benefits, the same ability. I don't want to become a vegetarian. You can look at me, you know I'm not a vegetarian. And the truth is that I like beef, and I like pork, and I like lamb. And if it's grown in a lab and I don't know that it's grown in a lab and they call it meat as meat as meat, and there hasn't been any testing done, we got a problem. So who's doing the testing?
Well, the primary mission here for FDA is safety, and we're gonna be looking hard at these kinds of questions through the development process, the sort of pre-harvest process, the nutritional content of it, whether or not it's comparable, whether or not there are risks being introduced into the product. But ultimately, we're working out a framework where there's going to be joint jurisdiction. That was the direction we got from Congress. We appreciate that direction. We've signed an MOU to implement that. And ultimately, the decisions about how that's implemented are going to be determined in guidance that we are working on right now. So I would say, in short, both agencies are going to have a role to play here.
So let me give you an example, and it's fairly controversial, but I believe in testing. I believe in testing for everything, whether you're talking prescription drugs or food, when it's been altered. And in the case of genetically modified grain, for example, when I asked a predecessor of yours about, are you going to do testing on grain that's been genetically manipulated to find out if it has the same qualities as the original kernel, they said, grain is grain is grain. That same argument could be used on lab-produced meat. Is that your view?
Well, I think it's getting to the original question that you asked me, which is, and it's a fair question, which is how are these going to be positioned in the market, and will the consumers have any disclosure around whether or not this is derived from a carcass versus a culturing process? And I think those issues are yet to be worked out, but ultimately, USDA is going to have purview over how this gets graded and how it gets positioned relative to meat, so that there is consistency across that USDA process.
Okay, well, I would just say this. First of all, thank you for your work, and I mean that. I think that you've done an admirable job as Commissioner of the FDA, and hopefully on your exit memo, you'll tell the next chap, whoever it may be, to make sure they do their due diligence. That's all I'm asking, because once you get something introduced into the food system, and if it's not what we think it is, then you get all sorts of medical costs. And since the ACA has been worked on to be done away with, who the hell's going to pay for it? Anyway, thank you very, very much.
Thanks a lot, Senator.